I've never really understood the appeal of giant jawbreakers. They do have a distinct look, though, which I hoped to replicate with a giant plastic pearl. Well, 2 plastic pearls, I guess. Although I didn't want them to be pearlescent, so they needed to be sanded and given a coat of white primer. The sticks were added to make spray painting them easier. While the primer on the beads was drying, I made the Twizzler leg assembly. The core of each leg is made up of floral stem wire, electrical tape, plastic lacing, and regular floral wire. To connect all the legs together in a sturdy framework, I used long pieces of stem wire bent into a U shape, with each side of the U in an adjacent leg to connect them all together. To build out the leg, I added a short piece of stem wire, as well as a length of flat plastic lacing, which was positioned on top of the 3 side-by-side pieces of stem wire. The whole bundle was held together with electrical tape. Then I spiraled a piece of regular floral wire tightly around the tape-wrapped bundle. I tried to make it as angled as possible on the front of the leg while keeping each wrap of wire as close as I could to the one before it, which made the lines of wire go almost horizontal on the back of the leg, but it's the back, so that's okay. Then I slid on a piece of red shrink tubing. This was a little tricky since I had made the core bundle as thick as possible while still barely fitting in the tubing. This was repeated until all of the legs were covered. Then I brought in my ugly table protector board, added some tiny binder clips to the ends of the tubing to pinch it shut, and blasted the thing with a heat gun. This shrunk the tubing tight around the core bundles, which allowed the wire wrapping to show through. Back to the beads. With a nice matte white finish, they're ready for some colorful splatters. I used alcohol ink for this, with mixed results. The toothbrush created too fine of a spray, and drops directly from the bottles were too big, so I ended up using rubbing alcohol to try and fix it. And I guess it looks sort of like a jawbreaker. Maybe? I didn't want to start all over, so it'll do. The Twizzler legs only sort of look like Twizzlers anyway. Or maybe red vines. Either way, the smaller bead was threaded onto the leg assembly, and then the large bead was added on and glued to both the wires and the smaller bead to hold it all together. Then it was just a matter of posing the legs and gluing on the eyes, and this big beastie was all finished. While I was making an inky mess of the Jawbreaker beads, I also used the alcohol ink to tint some 2mm rubber tubing. I could have just bought colored tubing, but it came in a big roll, and I figured white would be more useful for other projects. And that way I could tint it any color if I wanted it to be a color. Thankfully, this plan worked. I used the same wire structures for the sour spiders that I used for the pumpkin spiders. Floral wire held together in the middle by a bead cap and a dressmaker pin. Once I had the tubing threaded onto the legs, and the gumdrop and bead added to the middle, I moved on to the tedious part, adding the sour sugar coating. I tested a few different kinds of glue for this and settled on Mod Podge. It was the easiest one to get a thin, even coating on the whole leg, and it stayed wet long enough for me to get the fake sugar sprinkled all over. But I still had to do just a small section at a time and let it dry before doing the next one, which made finishing the whole spider take a while. Because the fake sugar I was using was so random and jagged in shape, some of it was barely holding on. So I watered down some clear tacky glue to dribble over the sugary legs to lock it in place. I also added a drop of yellow ink to try and tint it just a little more. The colored tubing didn't show through as well as I'd hoped. On the green sour spider, I used clear microbeads instead of fake sugar, because they matched the texture of the green bead better. They were much easier to glue on, and they didn't need any additional glue added afterwards to keep them in place. They also allowed the colored tubing to show through much better. I recommend doing this over a piece of paper so any excess microbeads, or fake sugar, can be funneled back into their container for later use. With that, all the sour spiders need are some eyes, and they're finished. The third one there was not going to be part of the lineup, but then I realized that the big bead was glow in the dark, so I went ahead and threw together some beaded legs for it, using the same wire structure that I used on the image candy spiders. Finally, the atomic fireball spiders. These are a lot flashier than the cinnamon candy that inspired them, but I wanted to convey the fire concept somehow. I used Angelina film to make the fire. This is a thin, iridescent plastic film that heat bonds to itself. It also shrinks and shifts in color when it's heated, which makes it a fussy but striking craft supply. I cut it into a sort of fiery, snowflakey shape, trying to avoid wasting any, and then prepared the body and legs of the spider for wrapping. These spiders use the same wire structure as the image candy spiders, with a little bit of extra wire added through the bead to make a long handle. Then, the Angelina film was wrapped around from the bottom, scrunching, twisting, and pinning where necessary, until all the legs were covered and the film was sticking upwards. I realize it's difficult to see what I'm doing on camera, but honestly, I didn't really know what I was doing. The finished spider on the table was the result of winging it to test the idea, and I was just doing my best to recreate a surprisingly successful test. Sadly, the one I wasn't filming worked a lot better. In hindsight, 8 smaller flame-shaped pieces would have worked a lot better than the one big, messy snowflake piece. Possibly with a small piece to join them all together on the belly of the spider. Since the film heat bonds to itself, there's really no need for it to be all one piece, and I just made the task more difficult for myself. The most important thing is for the film to be wrapped around the wire so that it can fuse to the leg by fusing to itself. Wrapping the wire with a long skinny strip of film before adding the flame-shaped pieces would probably help. I busted out the heat gun again to melt the Angelina film onto the spider, and crinkle up the flames coming off the top. And then, once it reached the point where I thought I was probably doing more harm than good, I added the big bead and trimmed and curled the wires to hold it in place. I added the final touches off camera, and somewhere in the process, I made a fun discovery. This orange Angelina film is UV reactive. It looks even more like fire than I hoped it would, and even though that makes the spiders look even less like candy than they already did, I am delighted with the result.